Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, when people bring the Buddhist teachings here and there, what happens to the gods and goddesses they were already worshipping?
It depends. Most of the time, worship of these gods survives and coexists alongside veneration of the Buddha. Indeed, it is very rare that the Buddha replaces the native gods entirely. However, sometimes they're folded into the Buddha's universe and come to be regarded as servants of the Buddha, envoys of him, or even manifestations of him.
Given that the Buddha rarely, if ever, speaks on the issues of native gods and spirits, I suppose there's room in the Dharma to account for them.
I would agree.
It seemed that the Buddha would encourage people to fold their gods and spirits into his realm. If it encourages diligent pursuit of the Buddha way, then it seems perfectly acceptable, if not even beneficial.
Indeed. Similarly, many of their teachings are not incompatible with the Dharma, further adding to the benefit of folding native gods and spirits into the Buddha's universe.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing Buddhism's arrival into Japan. What is the story of Buddhism's arrival into Japan? How did this relate with traditions of kami worship? How did this affect Japanese Buddhism going forward? We hope you enjoy. So, what is the story of Buddhism's arrival into Japan?
Once again, I'll mention here that many of the methodological problems that we mentioned in the China and Korea episodes persist here with regard to Japan. Buddhism entered Japan first among traders and people in the borderlands, and then probably later caught the attention of the rulership and was officially transmitted. We won't spend too much time setting that whole scheme up again. However, I would like to draw your attention to two facts. One is that Japan is removed from the mainland by roughly 120 miles of ocean at the closest point, creating another geographical barrier that people bringing things to and from Japan have to cross. The second fact is that although that barrier exists between Japan and South Korea, historically, there is a great deal of cultural exchange and trade and migration that takes place going both directions between present-day Japan and South Korea. It is this cultural exchange and trade that establishes the channel through which the unofficial historical transmission of Buddhism in the form of texts, icons, recitations, and more takes place. Unlike in China or Korea, this unofficial transmission is actually referred to explicitly in some later texts in Japanese history. There's a text from the 12th century AD called the Fuso Ryakuki, which alleges that there was a person who took up residence in present-day Japan and enshrined an icon there. This person is named in the source as Shiba no Tatsuto, and he was either Korean, Chinese, or descendant of a Korean migrant group in Japan, indicating the large amount of exchange of people and culture that took place between Korea and Japan. So let's set the stage for the official history. Though it likely arrived before this, Buddhism was officially brought to the Emperor of Japan, Kinmei, in the middle of the 6th century by an envoy from King Seong of the western South Korean kingdom of Baekje. This transmission is recorded in the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, two imperial histories from the 8th century. We would give a real reliable date for the transmission of Buddhism into Japan if we had one, but we have several dates from several sources, and so we can't know for sure. However, because all of these dates are roughly in the middle of the 6th century, we place the date of transmission somewhere in there. When Buddhism got to Japan in the form of ritual banners, sutras, and icons of the Buddha, the emperor asked his nobility if he should propagate Buddhism in the country, and there were two factions on the issue. One faction was led by the Soga clan, who supported the propagation of Buddhism. The other faction, which included the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, were worried that it would anger the native pantheon of gods, which we'll discuss when we discuss Japanese kami worship in a moment. According to the Nihon Shoki, the emperor then allowed the Soga clan to worship the Buddha, and only them, to see if the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans' claim would play out as they said. Before, during, and after all this happened, the country of Yamato, which is the ancient name for Japan, was struggling with disease, civil unrest, natural disasters, epidemics, and more. However, because relations between the two factions of nobility were already in the process of worsening, the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans jumped on the chance to blame all of these natural disasters and difficulties on the Soga clan's worship of the Buddha, alleging that they were indeed making the native pantheon of gods very angry. As you can see once again, Buddhism was inseparably tied to the political landscape wherever it was transmitted in East Asia, and that's the case here too. The Soga clan was a political entity which sought power, wealth, and influence, and saw the propagation of Buddhism as a means of achieving that. That's not to say that they were all bad or nefarious actors. They might have believed in Buddhism and in what the text said. However, the political machinations of the clans cannot be ignored. It was through their successful propagation of Buddhism in the country that they were able to gain enough power and support to win out over the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans in the end. Eventually, souring relations between these factions led to a civil war, with the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans on one side, and the Imperial House and the Soga clan and the immigrant Hada clan on the other. The Imperial House and the Soga clan won, and Buddhism became strongly propagated in Japan under the patronage of not only the wealthy Soga and Hata clans, but also the imperial family itself under Prince Shotoku. Prince Shotoku is credited as the semi-legendary founder of Japanese Buddhism. Under the reign of his mother-in-law, Empress Suiko, Shotoku is said to have commissioned the construction of holy sites, the translation and transcription of texts, and the propagation of Buddhism all over the country. He himself even wrote many commentaries on sutras and authored what is known as the 17-Article Constitution, a universal law of the land of Yamato that explicitly refers to the propagation of Buddhism as the duty of the emperor and as the ultimate law of the land. After this, Shotoku takes on a mythical status in Japanese Buddhism, but also in Japanese history at large. He's said to have lived a very, very long time, to have done all sorts of legendary things, and to have been a fully realized bodhisattva.
So there's 2 points in that discussion that I want to pick at a bit. First of all, when we were first talking about Buddhism moving out of India and into China, we were talking about the Himalayas being a huge geographical barrier, whereas here we've got 120 miles of ocean, and yet the ocean, it seems like, based on what we're discussing, a much lesser obstacle. So that kind of talks to how, first of all, crossing an ocean probably be easier than crossing the Himalayas. I don't know, but I could easily be convinced as much. And also, this is happening much later than the propagation from India to China happened. There are probably technology leaps that make that easier as well that weren't available for the first transition.
Yeah, you're right on all fronts. Crossing the ocean was actually historically a lot easier than crossing the mountains, right? I mean, that's kind of why Buddhism took the path of least resistance to get from India to China, in the sense that it didn't go due north over the mountains. It went west first, and then ended up in Central Asia, in the regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan and what is now Tibet. And then on the other count of the transmission from Korea to Japan, or from China to Japan, having a lot more technological support, that's also true. There was this entire culture of maritime networks that existed from ancient times on into like early modern times. And this maritime network was made up of traders who were multi-ethnic, and that they didn't live in any single place, and they had family members and bloodlines that could be traced back to China, Korea, and Japan, and other places even, like Russia. And they existed in this network of trading goods, but incidentally, at the same time, they were trading culture as well. So there's lots of islands. We've talked about how Japan is an archipelago, and there's thousands of islands. They discover new ones on a regular basis because it's a volcanic archipelago and new islands get created. And there's many islands which serve as waypoints where people on boats go and get fresh water. And if an island serves as a consistent enough source of fresh water, the sailors will go there over and over again, and more sailors will go there whenever they're on their way somewhere. And eventually you start to see permanent shrines, permanent artifacts start to show up on these islands historically, because it's consistent and because it's in a convenient place on a trade route or something like that. And these icons and these shrines and these artifacts are part of this sort of, I don't want to say oceanic religion, but it's definitely like a religious connection of ideas where they are praying for their safety on the seas and for profit whenever they go to sell their stuff. And a lot of this got conflated with kami worship, Korean indigenous religion, Chinese indigenous religion, and Buddhism, and all kinds of stuff. So we can look to these islands historically to kind of see this unofficial transmission of Buddhism, but again, it doesn't look exactly how we're used to. The difficulty is that these islands are protected, so it's actually illegal to go there for scholarly study nowadays because they're sacred religious sites. So you can't go there and report on what you've seen, and you can't take anything from there and leave with it. Nowadays, that is completely prohibited and is regarded as not only very illegal, but also very bad religious form, like bad fortune. Makes the place less holy. And there's a whole history there we don't have to get into as to why that's happened, but it's a barrier to studying this sort of thing in the modern era.
That'd be an interesting to go and look at, but it's not permitted. And that sort of study is something that should only be done with permission.
Exactly.
So the other thing I wanted to point out, and this one we don't have to spend as long on, but here's another one where we can't make a clear dividing line between, in this case, religion and politics. They're the same thing here.
That's exactly right. Religious factions in nobility are political factions, and they often have very far-reaching political implications. This is especially true in China when it comes to Taoism and Confucianism. Those are very clearly cut and dry political philosophies. In my opinion, when I read them and when I look at them, I can see the policies that come through them. Buddhism, you can't really see it as much. You kind of have to read a little bit more and get a little more context to understand sort of the political implications that it has. But also, we're lucky when we study this sort of thing in that we have writings from the imperial house and from the Soga clan, which was aligned with the imperial house, which mark out a very clear agenda, which essentially was for the Soga clan to marry into the imperial house as much as possible, and even possibly seat an emperor on the throne, which they did during their history. And in doing so, basically get to control the entire narrative of the Yamato rulership. And also in doing so, they sought to elevate the status, the power, the influence, the wealth of the imperial house to the level of living godhood. And one of the routes to do that was through Buddhism. You could make the living emperor or the living prince into a bodhisattva, a living bodhisattva whose responsibility was to propagate Buddhism in the land and whose responsibility as a ruler was to be living according to the Dharma and making sure everyone else is too. And that's exactly what we can see happening in this period in history. So it's very interesting that we have that political history of Buddhism in Japan because we don't have as much of that political history in India, China, or Korea when it comes to Buddhism specifically.
So once more, we have that line where we're going, is this religion, is this something else, and failing to make that line, as we have before. So, let's get back to the script. How did this relate with traditions of kami worship?
In order to get to this question, we should first explain what kami worship is. Kami worship is a collective name that scholars give to the many disparate and disconnected traditions of ancestor worship and quote-unquote animism that can be observed all across present-day Japan, but also in ancient times. Just like in Korea and China, natural forces were believed to be under the purview of sentient deities who needed to be ritually placated or related with in some way. Similarly, ancestor worship was a very prevalent practice as a means of preventing evil spirits from plaguing the community and as a means of ensuring that the deceased had a good afterlife or a good rebirth. Mountains, forests, the sky, the ocean, rain, wind, and more were viewed as containing spirits that must be related with so as to maintain harmony and prosperity among the community. In different regions, these gods had different names, different characteristics and aspects, and different rituals attached to them. Thus, just like in Korea and China, studying it is extremely difficult because it's so local and so deeply buried under layers of history and change.
I've heard the term Shinto before. Is that kami worship or is that a brand of kami? Like, how does that word fit into this discussion?
That's a very good question, and it's important that we address that. in talking about Buddhism and kami worship. I say kami worship because I'm referring to a total collective idea and practice and tradition of rituals and deities all across the Japanese archipelago in pre-modern times. And we should note that Shinto is a very emperor-centric narrative. Shinto collects different ideas, different deities, different rituals from all of these disparate, disconnected sort of ritual traditions to create itself because it's an emperor legitimizing tradition. We'll get into the history about that, but Shinto is sort of the imperial narrative that gives power to the Japanese imperial house. Just like the emperor is a bodhisattva whose responsibility is to propagate the dharma in the land, he is also a living kami who should be treated as like a direct descendant of the creators of the universe. So it's kind of an interesting tradition with, again, a very complicated history, but we'll talk more about that in a second when we get to the authorship of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki.
So, in short, Shinto is kind of a specific sub-branch of kami worship.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
As I said before, this kami worship generally took place all over Japan throughout history. But we should give some attention to what was going on in what we could call the historical center of influence in Japan, which was the southern region. This region of Yamato I mentioned earlier, over which ruled the Yamato Emperor, covered the Kanto Plain, which is the flat area where Tokyo is, as well as the Kansai region, which contains Osaka, Kyoto, and further southern and western regions, including the island of Shikoku to the south, and the region containing the city of Fukuoka to the west. In other words, the regions in the northernmost and easternmost parts of Japan, as well as areas to the far southwest, were not part of the Yamato region historically. The center of imperial influence in this region was the present-day Nara Prefecture. In this area, the imperial house exerted a great deal of power and influence over traditions of kami worship. The imperial histories I mentioned earlier, the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, were commissioned narratives that allegedly document the entirety of Japanese history from the creation of Japan all the way up through the current reigning emperor. As such, they contained divine narratives that argued that the emperor was the divine descendant of the gods. This narrative borrowed much from distant and disparate myths and ritual traditions and legends and deities that were already circulating in the Yamato region of Japan. Borrowing from these different areas and traditions to construct this narrative served the purpose of garnering support of the various peoples in the Yamato rulership, and thus legitimated the emperor's rule and his divinity, as well as that of his entire family line. So this kami worship tradition existed all over and throughout history, but the commissioning of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki marked a transformation in that tradition, which mobilized it in support of the Yamato emperor, and we could call this the earliest roots of Shinto. Now we're starting to see why the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans were worried that Buddhism receiving patronage and sponsorship from the imperial house could have been dangerous. If the emperor, the living progeny of the divine, was seen to betray that divine pantheon in favor of a foreign religion, they would likely become very angry and threaten the power and stability of the entire Yamato state. However, the result was much more similar to how things played out in Korea. Rather than there being a conflict on these grounds, Buddhism and kami worship actually came to coexist quite nicely with each other. The Yamato emperor was able to remain a living kami while at the same time being a bodhisattva and a divine patron of Buddhism. This is the cause and the result of a number of doctrinal innovations that we'll mention in the next question.
I suspect if we were to go back and really dissect the political implications, there would be a whole lot more going on in this situation than what we're talking about just from the Buddhist side. But the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans are kind of correct, it sounds like. They lose that conflict. Buddhism wins, and we get to Buddhism is as a force, in Japan at least, that centralizes power. And so the Buddhists and the emperor win that conflict.
That's right, yeah. The Soga clan and the emperor, the imperial family, they definitely come out on top. And it's not least due to the fact that I think that there were several Soga clan-born emperors in Japanese history, and so the Soga clan, for a short period, had a great deal of influence, and they were able to be in charge of the narrative in a very big way.
So how do all of these factors affect Japanese Buddhism going forward?
It's a very fascinating question because when Buddhism got to Japan, it was already a very, very old textual and ritual tradition. There were 1,000 years separating the arrival of Buddhism into Japan from the death of the Buddha himself. During that whole time, Chinese and Korean Buddhist thinkers were transcribing sutras and texts, which were orally recited and had already taken on several versions, and they were translating those sutras and texts from the original languages into their local languages, which itself was an act of interpretation and revision. For example, how does one translate a concept like shunyata, emptiness, from Sanskrit into Chinese or Korean? One has two options, which are equally important for the Buddhist tradition. One could translate the concept or the meaning of the word and grab onto a locally available word that somewhat captures the meaning. This is an extremely difficult route to take because there may not be a word that captures the full meaning of that concept in a complete or accurate fashion, and so without the addition of footnotes or explanations, a lot of meaning is at risk of being lost.
Within our own show, I would say dukkha probably hits that pretty hard.
Exactly. That's a great example of where the original contextual meaning of the word is not captured by the translation in a very complete sense. However, translating in this way, trying to reach for something that encompasses the meaning, is an important act of translation because it allows the text to become accessible to the local audience. There's no other option. We can't walk around saying dukkha and expect anyone around us to know what we mean. The other route of getting this idea from one place to another is to take existing sounds in the language that equate to the sound of the word and use those. This is equally important as a method of transcribing/translating, and the reason why is because, as we know, practitioners will recite, and that's one of the most important practices that allows Buddhism to be spread in a place where it goes. So wherever somebody goes, they may not be able to read the parent texts, but they may be able to replicate the sounds of the text orally. Thus, if this comes first, it would make sense that when it is finally written down, it will be written in a way that accounts for recitation of the original Sanskrit rather than based on the meaning of the original Sanskrit. However, as we mentioned, there are many different versions of recitations in Buddhism, confounding the transmission of the text or the recitation at hand. All of these complications and processes had been taking place for quite a long time by the time Buddhism made it to Japan. Similarly, the whole canon did not arrive in Japan all at once. Those texts and practices which were most popular in Korea and China were the ones that arrived first. These texts happened to be Mahayana texts, such as the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Nirdesa Sutra, and the Heart Sutra, but also texts such as the Golden Light Sutra, which is probably apocryphal, but contains a sermon given by the Buddha to kings on how to rule benevolently. Also, Madhyamaka texts on the Middle Way and on emptiness made it to Japan early on as well. These texts came to be very popular and influential in Japanese Buddhism going forward. Additionally, many interesting doctrinal innovations take place in Japan which serve to bridge the gap between Buddhism and kami worship. One of the most historically significant of these is the doctrine of Honji Suijaku. This is the idea that all kami are skillful means manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Thus, Buddhism was able to bring all of kami worship under its influence and cosmology, and make meaningful sense of how the emperor could be a living kami as well as a bodhisattva and sacred protector of Buddhism. This unique and politically oriented cosmology was critically important in Japanese history and in Buddhism's history. For example, rituals for consecrating Buddhist temples involved invocations to the local kami and to the emperor to permit the use of the land for a temple. Also, when monks preach, they are seen to be preaching to the native kami and spirits in addition to the human members of the audience. We should also mention that because of the emperor's position in this cosmology, he had many complicated responsibilities. Imagine a cosmology that is shaped like two pyramids, one on the bottom and one on the top, with the tip inverted downward and touching the tip of the first one. This should be almost hourglass-shaped. The bottom pyramid is the cosmology of the realm of Japan. It has people, spirits, kami, hungry ghosts, animals, the government, and the emperor at the top. The above inverted pyramid is the cosmology of the Buddhas and the universe. It has Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Dharma in it, and the emperor at the bottom. Thus, the emperor was beholden to both cosmologies. In the bottom pyramid, he was responsible for maintaining harmony and prosperity among the Japanese people by being reverent and ritually pious to the kami and by governing effectively. In the top pyramid, he was beholden to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to propagate the Dharma and live the Bodhisattva path. And this is only the Buddhist cosmology. He also has to deal with the Shinto cosmology as well. Whenever he failed any of these duties, the result was disorder, unrest, or disaster. This could be natural disasters, invasions, epidemics, rebellions, any sort of bad thing that happens in the realm. When those things inevitably did happen, it served to further support the narrative that it was the emperor's fault because he failed somehow. Knowing all of this cosmology, we should note that Japanese Buddhism came to be very unique in practice and doctrine as compared to other iterations of Buddhism. Naturally, it had numerous traceable roots to Chinese and Korean Buddhism, but there were many unique developments that make it very interesting to study. One good example is this Honji Suijaku doctrine, of course. It's spelled Honji space Suijaku. But there are also examples with regards to Tendai and Shingon, where they adapted Tibetan styles of Buddhism and Western Chinese styles of Buddhism into esoteric Buddhism in Japan. And there's also very interesting Shinto-esque or kami worship-like practices that go on, especially in Zen, Pure Land, and Shingon Buddhism. And we should also note that Nichiren Buddhism is very emphatic on the cosmology I've just described because it kind of places the Lotus Sutra in the center of those two pyramids with the emperor himself. And so the responsibility of the emperor to both cosmologies, to the realm of Japan and to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, is to propagate specifically the Lotus Sutra. And we've talked a lot about how it's entirely up for debate what the central teaching of the Lotus Sutra is and how to propagate it and what you're propagating and how you rule a country according to it. So these are all very interesting things that you can look up and study whenever you're interested in Japanese Buddhism, and you can easily fall down a rabbit hole with them because they're just fantastic. I've fallen down that rabbit hole and now it's my whole career.
I've fallen down that rabbit hole a time or two as well. There's always interesting stuff to look up with Buddhism, wherever it is.
I agree completely.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Buddhism's arrival into Japan. Join us next week where we will discuss the Great Doubt in Buddhism. What is the Great Doubt in Buddhism? How does one cultivate it? Why ought one cultivate it? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.